Okay. Okay, I'll explain a little bit about what the class is about today. We're going to talk primarily about record hints. The idea here is that we have a lot of partner programs with FamilySearch. They are supplying us with sort of an endless conveyor belt of record hints, and the question is, we don't need to get distracted. We should try to avoid being distracted by those hints, and we should focus on some basic principles of research so that we use the hints that come in properly and can evaluate whether they're accurate or not. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of the whole class. Basically what the problem, what I wanted to do was, because during the last few months we have been working on, my family has been working on some of the traditional, I want to call it traditional end-of-line people, people that where nobody could seem to find any place to extend their lines for the last 100 years. One of the concerns that we still have, obviously, is that there were some things that were decidedly dysfunctional about Family Tree. A lot of us still have the impression that it's kind of a mess, a chaotic mess. Well, my perception is a little bit different. I acknowledge that there are still some limitations. For example, if you reach a line in the FamilySearch.org family tree and it says cannot be merged at this time to a person that cannot be merged, that's the end of what you should be doing there, basically, because if you go beyond that and somebody merges that person with somebody else, or it changes the structure of the line beyond that point, you may just lose everything you had worked on. Or you may discover that you're not even related to all these people in the first place. So what I'm going to show is some ways that, at least the way that we, meaning me and my family, my wife and my 3 daughters who are now helping us work on all this, the approach that we use to generating this information. And I have to say that the record hints part and the searching part of these programs is the key to being able to go back with these lines where people have never had any success doing that previously. Okay, so, and I don't like to use the term brick wall, because that seems to imply that somebody is out there preventing you from getting the work done, and that isn't the way that it works. It's your brick wall. It's not their brick wall. Okay, so we're going to look here at FamilySearch. And I might mention, kind of to emphasize that over the past about 8 to 10 months, FamilySearch has really solidified the family tree. Except for those lines that have those residual problems with merging and things like that, most of the information on the tree is pretty static. And the lines that we've worked on and been successful with have really haven't had a lot of changes. What I say is what we've done is we've built what I call an allegorical electrical fence around our work. So we have put up, those electric fences with the little tags on them every once in a while. We watch everything. And of course, if anything changes, then now we have 5 people watching it. And my daughters are not hesitant to send me texts and say, somebody just changed this. So it's, and the response, we respond completely and immediately. In other words, if they aren't looking at the sources and they've added somebody that isn't something that's inappropriate, then we change it back immediately and send them off a message saying this is why it's been changed in detail. So it's basically a way of getting the matter, but that hasn't happened very often. The lines that I'm looking at are primarily those out here on my Tanner line, but not the Tanners. We're talking about the Parkinsons. And so we're going to go out here to Thomas Parkinson and look at that and see what we need to know about this. Thomas Parkinson, according to the information that I had at the time, was born in Farset, Huntingdonshire, England. He died in Beaver, Utah. which leads you to believe that he joined the church somewhere and came to America and ended up in Beaverdine. Interesting, the line goes back only 3 generations, 2 to 3 generations beyond this person in England. And the other interesting thing was that when I started looking at this, someone had used a record hint to add an entirely family that was not from Huntingdonshire, but was from Lancashire and from Manchester. Okay, now when we talk about things like that in England, most of us are not familiar enough with the English counties and the geography to realize what that means. But if I were saying that in the United States, I would say that this family was from Arizona and somebody added another family from Minnesota. And then you would go, well, maybe that isn't the same family. You'd have to see that there was some connection between the 2 places. Well, that's, even on a much smaller scale, that's what the situation is in England, because we're talking about people who lived in the early 1800s back to the early 1700s, and in the 1700s, these people did not move. Most of them did not. There were some exceptions, and we have to know why it's an exception if we find somebody outside of the area where these people all are focused. So we're going to see how that works. So we'll go back here. First of all, I looked at how many sources, and there was an interesting thing. There's lots of sources here now because I've been spending the last couple of months adding sources to this family. But the interesting thing was that none of these sources dealt with any information. The only sources that were really in here were information that came from the United States. So we had all these people going back. There were no birth, marriage, or death records cited for England. In fact, going back just 2 generations, there were no sources at all. So there was no way for me to know whether or not how much of this information was correct. And the second part of that was, there's a big book out there. It's called James Parkinson of Ramsey. It's a very well done book. It's beautiful. It's over 700 pages. It's full of family group records. Has lots of stories and lots of everything in it. It's very valuable with photos and everything else to the family. The problem is there's not one specific citation in the entire book. So they say parish registers show, and they say things like journal says this, but they don't give us any specific place how we go to that. Pages, where it is, roll numbers on the films, anything. Okay, so it was nice, and the question is, well, mostly, let's just say it right up front, mostly what I've done is confirm the information that was in the book, but that may not have always been the case, and there have been some exceptions of some things that changed from what they have put in there. Okay, so that's not a criticism, it's just simply an observation, because back when these books were done, it was not emphasized that we put in all the sources. So people just didn't have a tendency to do that. Okay, so now we're going to look at him. We'll go back another line, and this is the James Parkinson of the book. And he was supposedly born in Ramsey, and he died in Dungog, New South Wales, Australia. Okay, so right off the bat, you have an interesting situation. And one thing you wanted to check when you do this is to go down and check where all of the children that are listed for that person were born and died. So their first one's Huntingdonshire, next is Thomas, who's Huntingdonshire, next is Sarah, who's in Cambridgeshire, it says, and then she dies in Tokerville, okay, so obviously she must have come to the United States. The fourth one is born in England and dies in Yorkshire, England. So we have this family with people being born in England and dying in Australia, people born in England and dying in the United States, and people being born in England who die in England. And so the question is, are all these people really in the same family? Do we really have all the same people that are listed traditionally in the genealogy. Okay, so let's go back another generation and see what happens. So we're going back to Charles Parkinson. And he is supposed to be born in Great Raveley, Huntingdonshire. And his death is in Ramsey. All these are starting to sound a little bit familiar. His wife's name is Hepzibah Newton, and she's from Ramsey and dies and born there. And then their children, as we go back here, Anne Parkinson, Ramsey, James Parkinson was the one we just looked at that died in Australia, and then Sarah Parkinson, no death place, Thomas Parkinson, another Thomas Parkinson, no death place, Mary Parkinson, no death place, but they all have specific birth dates, which, by the way, turn out to be primarily christening dates, not birth dates. So that's another situation we have to be concerned about. Okay, so what do I have to do with this? Well, first of all, the challenge was I got to find one record at least that shows that these people actually came from Huntingdonshire. How about a record that shows somebody was born or lived in Huntingdonshire? I mentioned or learned any. Okay, so that was the big challenge. Well, that's where this came in. You can search over here in FamilySearch on all these programs. FamilySearch, Ancestry, Find My Past, My Heritage. Now, here's the key. This is the kind of the chicken and the egg problem. The chicken and the egg problem is this. Which came first? Proving that the person lived in the place, or finding some record that showed that they lived there? What if you already have the information wrong? Okay, so that's the problem. The problem is, and if you I went through it really fast, but if if you were a genealogist of answering lots of questions in the family history library over the years, you'd realize real quick, and probably would have stopped me and said, well, why does this one say they were born in Cambridgeshire? How do we get that person in the lineup when everybody else seems to be from some other place? And the answer of how I did this was, the information that I had that was verifiable and correct was Thomas Parkinson in Beaver and Tokerville, Utah, because he was basically here. We had no problem finding his census records, everything else about him, his death records, and he said where he was born. So we can kind of make an assumption there that maybe that's correct. Maybe he knew where he was born, so that might be a good idea. Things like the death certificate, things like that, help us to come into where he was born. So we're working our way back, but we're going to have to find something that verifies it. Well, I did. So I came in here and I found an 1841 English census, and it came up under Ancestry in Ancestry.com. And it showed his wife, whose name was Hepzibah Newton, and of course the census person had, totally misunderstood what she said and written it down as Epsiby instead of Hepzibah, which she probably couldn't say correctly anyway, because we probably had never heard anybody say it correctly. And so and they list being in Whittlesea in Cambridgeshire, England. And there's Charles in the right date, and his wife, whose name really is Hepzibah, the right age, and a son named Thomas, who was listed and has the right age. And they're in Whittlesea. Well, the problem here is Cambridgeshire versus Huntingdonshire. And the question is, if I got a record hint that said that I found a record that showed that they were in Cambridgeshire, how do I know that this is the same family as Huntingdonshire? What if I just have another Charles Parkinson and a wife who has a name that I'm not familiar with, and that I'm not going to assume is Hepzibah, and a son named Thomas? And the answer to that is we need to do some more research the first thing I did was to go do some historical research on Huntingdonshire. So I looked it up in the Wikipedia, simply, you know, don't have to have a real, I mean, I don't have to do anything extensive. I just have to put in Huntingdonshire history and history of Huntingdonshire right there in Wikipedia. And then when I get down here a ways, it says that they go back and forth, that Huntingdonshire and Cambridgeshire were at one time considered to be unified with one sheriff. Sometimes they were split into two counties, and basically doing some more information about the history, go back and get more. This doesn't tell me enough what I needed to know. And then I go to another website, and it says that goes through the history here of Huntingdonshire and points out some other things, and then says, after the failure of Huntingdonshire to become a unitary authority, a Huntingdonshire Society was set up to promote awareness of the Huntingdonshire as a historic county. And the reason for this was that in 1972, Huntingdonshire and Peterborough merged with Cambridgeshire. Okay, so what they're saying is that Huntingdonshire disappeared. Cambridgeshire was the surviving county, and that people all got up in arms and tried to prevent it and said, we want to go back to Huntingdonshire. They held an election and said no, and now it's all Cambridgeshire. Okay, so that was the reason why we're seeing this confusion. We're seeing record that says that they're in Cambridgeshire, and now I have to put that into my mind when I'm looking at the record hints that are coming from these programs. If I see a record hint where the names are similar or the same and the dates are about right, and it's from Cambridgeshire, then I really have to consider it. I can't just say, oh, it's Manchester, and that's way out of my area of concern. So it really takes some particular research to get to the point where these record hints can be used effectively or at all. Otherwise, you can do what we're seeing now is people just clicking them and adding them without even evaluating or looking at to whether or not they're the same person. It's even vaguely the same person. You know, the idea there is, oh, well, FamilySearch gave us this record hint, or Ancestry gave me this record hint. It must be right. No, it's a hint. It isn't necessarily correct. Okay, so we'll go into that a little bit more. Sure.
That raises the question, so then do you ignore the hint if you think it doesn't apply, or do you say it's not a match?
Well, you ignore it. There's an ignore category on all these. Some of them, Ancestry actually gives you a accept, I don't know, and ignore. So it'll put it in a sort of a suspended category. Most of the others say no, either say it's no or yes, this is not the same person. So that's what everybody else does.
If you answer no, does that affect future searches?
Yeah.
Just what?
If you answer no, not a match or whatever, does that affect future searches?
Yes, it does. Because if you tell them that's the reason why we try to attach all the record hints that are correct, even if they're what look like duplicates, because we're telling the computer program, yes, this is correct. If you say it's not, then it's going to say, no, we're not going to give you any more record hints like that. And so that's not a good idea, just because you don't.
Does the other researchers get the wrong one?
Well, if they hit the wrong ones and add it to your person's, if somebody else adds one in there, you can always detach that source.
Okay.
Yeah, And that's what we've been doing. That's what I'm talking about when we watch these people and they put in these sources, then we take them right out. Okay, so this gave me an idea that these people were in Whittlesey, but that brings up an entirely different question. And that question is, are all of these places related? You know, even though we're talking about Huntingdonshire is a county, not, and it's very possible to have more than one person in a county, for example, that has the same name. Nobody ever happens that way? We don't. Okay, well, we know that that's the case. Okay, so what did I do? Well, I went into Google Maps, and Google Maps is always helpful like this. And this is the same one you'd use to, you know, find your friend's house in Pleasant Grove, or find a store in Salt Lake, or a doctor's office or something. So you're going to go in here and put in addresses. Well, we're going to put in the addresses. So I'm going to start here and put in Ramsey, UK, and there's Ramsey, Huntingdonshire District, UK, so we can click on that one, and that takes us to Ramsey. I'm going to have to zoom out a little bit so we can see what's around it. And now I'm just going to get directions. I'm going to get directions from Ramsey to, for instance, Farset. That was another one of these places. And there's Farset, Huntingdonshire, United Kingdom, and there's the road to Farset. It's about, well, it says 3 miles, but that's taking along roundabout roads. It's about 7 miles, okay, total. Okay, and now let's go to the next place. There was one that said Great Raveley, and there it is. And there's Great Raveley. And then we added in another one, and another one that was in here was Whittlesey. And let's see, there it is, Whittlesey, United Kingdom. Okay, now as I did this, was very extensive. I went through the descendancy and all of the lines of all the people I had. I looked at the birthplaces, death places, anything that had been listed there traditional, not what I had sources for, but what was there traditionally. And I added all those into a list. I actually created a Google Doc and started listing all those places down. And then, once I had that list, then I did this on the map for all of those places. So I went through, and you can do up to 12, I think. It started maxing out at about 12 different locations on Google Maps. But then I just started another map and did the rest of them.
Benchmarks and SWOT.
Yeah, and so basically I kept copies of the maps. But what it showed when I got through was that all of these areas, all of these people lived within like a 10-mile radius of each other. They had been born, they died, and they all lived right there. Now that's typical, because as you go back, what you're going to find is that in genealogical research is that families tend to focus in on what we call a geographic cluster. They're going to be all in one little area when you get back far enough. And so we're back there where they're all living in this geographic cluster, and that makes it easier for us to evaluate any of the record hints that we get. Because if somebody throws a record hint at us that says they're from Manchester or whatever, then we know pretty quick that we haven't got somebody in the cluster, and so there's not going to be a very good chance that that's a relative. Now, that requires also some additional research. You're simply not going to add that person automatically without evaluating why they would have gone to that place. I mean, the same problem we run into here with people showing up in Australia. And so basically what I had to do with all the records, the Australian part of it was that I had to start doing research in Australia. And that I used FindMyPast.com. And FindMyPast very quickly found me death records, inquest records, the passenger lists, and the immigration and all those kind of records out of England and into Australia for the families. So that was something that was answered. So now that we have that information, all of that, what we basically begin to understand where these people are, then we can start using the programs to find more information. And so what I wanted to do was to kind of go through and show how we would go about finding that information and using the record hints that are on MyHeritage. This is the same, and it's kind of, if you think about it, everything I say about MyHeritage is going to apply to FamilySearch, is going to apply to Find My Past, is going to apply to Ancestry or any other program out there. We're going to make the same approach doing this. Now, first of all, from my standpoint here, and let's see if I can actually zoom in on a screen. Is that going to not? I'm not going to get a zoom in the screen with this. Probably can't read it, but up here there are two different kinds of matches. There's smart matches, and the smart matches are, from my standpoint, suggestions to contact people. They're telling you that they have identified somebody in your family tree. By the way, it says on MyHeritage it is your family tree, not shared with anyone else. But they've identified somebody who you share an ancestor with, a relative with. Okay, my number right now is more than 100,000. Yes, I really am related to that many people. And I usually say, how many of you am I related to here? At least one, two, okay, yeah. Okay, so we're, in this part of the country, it's inevitable that I will end up running into people that I'm related to. But that isn't very helpful to me, because there's no way in the world I'm going to contact 100,000 people or have the time or interest to do that. So I'm going to show in a minute, I'll show you how to kind of filter out those people, find ones if you really are interested in talking to somebody, why you would do that. The next one are the record matches, and this is what we're really interested in, because they're doing research for us. And whether or not they find a record match in their program, meaning one of these four programs or any other program, is dependent on what kind of records they have. If they don't have the records for where your family is located, not going to do you any good. I mean, they're not going to find anything. But on the other side of that coin is, if they're not finding record hints for you, you can probably assume that they don't have the records that you need to go look for, so you don't have to spend a lot of time looking. So as you go through here and find out that that they're finding records that are helpful to you, then that gets your attention, and you start focusing in on those programs that have the right records. Now, what happens if you find out when you get all the way through this process that none of them have the right records? Well, guess what? If I were to do that and sit here today, I could go in and look for records, for example, in Ramsey, Huntingdonshire, England, in each of those four programs, and see what they have on their digital, searchable records. And the answer is none. So what did I have to do? Well, I'll show you. Hopefully I'll get to that point here before we end. But basically, I have my list of places. I put surnames in for each of the places, so I knew a list of all the people I would be looking for in that area. And then I went into the catalog for FamilySearch and started to see whether or not there were any microfilms. Well, the FamilySearch happens to have microfilms for all these places. And so I started a list of putting down the microfilm numbers for each parish that I needed to look at in Huntingdonshire. And that gave me a list of, right now, I haven't completed it, but it's probably going to have something between 50 and 100 microfilms to look at. Now, why would I do that? What I have to do, basically, is sit down and one by one go through each one of those microfilms, page by page, and look for all the people that I can that are related to me in this little tiny area. The difference is that presently my pedigree for these people goes back only about to the 1700s. Most of the parish registers in this area go back to the 1500s. So there's about 200 years worth of people living in this area that we haven't had in the family tree. See, so that's kind of the key to, this process is also the key to extending your pedigree beyond the places where it's traditionally ended. And if you think, well, people have been trying for years and no one's been able to get through those, whatever, end-of-line situations before, the answer is they didn't have all of these tools that we have today. We really have received, by this time in 2015, we have really gotten a overwhelming number of records that nobody really had access to very easily or ever before. So that's the reason why this can happen. So what are we going to do with this? Well, first of all, we'll take a look at the family tree here for MyHeritage, and we'll see that it's rather expansive here. It goes way out here. Here's the Parkinson's line. Here's our Parkinson's. And actually, if you look down here at the bottom, there's a little schematic of like a thumbnail of the whole tree, and there's a green slider that you can use to move across and look at it all and stretch it out. So it can become pretty overwhelming. And I suggest that if you do get to this situation where you have this many names and this many people in your tree, that you go at this a little bit of a different way. And that is, you go up here to family tree and you look at your people. And in this case, we're going to go over to the P, Parkinson people. And there's still quite a bit few here, 409. So let's put in Parkinson as our search term. And now we have just the Parkinson's, 34 Parkinson's, that I have in my family tree. Okay, so now we're focusing in on these people. The question is, how do we know if there's any record hints for these people? Well, we could go back and look through the record hints and look by name and look up each person. But there's a more efficient way to do this, and that is just click on each of these people, the ones we're interested in researching, like Charles Parkinson here, and look at his profile. And right here is the record hint. This one has a green check mark which says that I've already looked at it and incorporated that into my family tree. And if there were any other record hints for this person, then they would show up here. Okay, so now what we have is we're using the program to reinforce the research that we've already done in the family tree. And we are also in a position now to evaluate any records that they might find to see if they're ours or not, because we have a little bit more information than just taking somebody's word for the fact that that was what happened. Okay, so, but here we find something very useful, because I was doing all that research over in the family tree, and the question is, how do I synchronize what I did in family tree with what's now in MyHeritage? If I've added a bunch of stuff to the family tree and changed dates or moved things around or taken the places out. By the way, as I was doing those place name searches, I found out that some of the place names that they had in there in the family tree were actually streets. Okay, it's a street. It wasn't anything else. It wasn't a town or anything, or a parish. It was a street. And some of them were actually just the names of houses. In one case, all of these people, the ones that are up there in Whittlesey, were actually tenant farm workers in a manner, and the address they have, or the place where they were supposedly living, was the name of the house. So that's why some of these things sometimes don't make sense or can't be found. And that's particularly the same. By the way, this extends out. If you're doing research in Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, any of those countries, if you're doing research in Wales, if you're doing research in Germany, France, France or Spain or Italy, Mexico, Latin America, any country where you're actually doing research that has this European parish Catholic Church and the derivative churches tradition is going to have exactly the same process. I'm doing the same thing looking for common surnames and the locations in Mexico as I'm looking for the same information in England and the same information that my wife's looking for in Sweden. And we're using the same exact process of separating out these people so that we know who is who. You know, just within the time I've been teaching this class this week, I've had people come and say, well, I have a relative who is only a few miles away from this other person and they both have the same name, and I used to have them confused and we had them all mixed up together, and now I think they're two different people, but I can't figure out how to separate them. Well, this is what we do. This is how we separate the people out. It's through doing very, very specific research on the locations where these people live. Okay, so now what are we going to do to get this? Well, if I click on this, and if I hadn't done this before, then it will bring up the information over on the left-hand side that I have in my tree on MyHeritage, and then the information that I have that's coming from the FamilySearch Family Tree. And then I can extract or compare the two, and on the left-hand side is Family Tree, on the right-hand side is my MyHeritage Family Tree. If there were any differences, there would be little arrows in here telling you that there were differences, and you would have the option of moving that information into MyHeritage from Family Tree. Now, the question is, are you going to try to do this with all the 8,000 people you have in the tree? And the answer is probably not. But that's where I'm saying we need to focus in on the families, the individuals that we are actively researching. And we need to be aware enough of what needs to be done with our research to make that focus in the first place. So we need to know if there's some reason why we need to start working on a particular line or family. That doesn't mean I work on one line or one family at a time. The nice thing about having my daughters involved and my wife sort of also involved, actually the reason I keep mentioning my wife Ann, because as we've done this more extensively, we now are pretty sure that we're cousins. Okay.
First cousins?
Well, sixth cousins. I think we would have figured out first cousins pretty quickly.
You're okay then.
And I don't think we would have gotten there. But, no, so what we have is a way to move this information one way, and then I'm going to show you in just a minute how to get it all back into, from MyHeritage into FamilySearch. And it looks to me like we're really going to have to add in something. I'm going to have to make my bookmark and show the bookmarks bar. I got it, okay. So now I may have to be adding a bookmark here too. Okay, now we're back to, we'll get back to Charles Parkinson here. Now, another thing that's important is that you can actually, I mean, people have a tendency to go research these things. And they have a thing up there that says research and so forth. So we're going to look and see how that works. Well, first of all, if I click up here on the research tab, I see that there are 6.3 billion records here on MyHeritage. Now, MyHeritage has acquired some very, very, very useful resources just recently. One of those resources is that they will translate names from language to language. So if you put in Peter and your ancestors came from Spain, they're going to be able to see that that's Pedro. So there's going to be this translation between different languages for the entries on the names. And their search engines will search all of the possible translated names and nicknames and things like that for anybody you put in. So if you put in Elizabeth, they'll search Beth, they'll search Betty, they'll search Eliza, they'll search Liz, they'll search all of that. So that's been incorporated. Now the next thing they did was they created this ability that when you do find a contact between people that you have, you can actually collaborate directly with individuals within the program in doing the research. So there's a research connection there. And the third thing that just came out very, very recently is MyHeritage has added in 150,000 digitized, completely word for word indexed. They did character recognitions to get all the words in all these books, 150,000 genealogy books that now are going to be completely searchable and will be coming up as record hints for the program. Now, these books are not just somebody's library. It's not like the family history library where they are just digitizing everything on the shelves. What they have done is selected a group of 40 people who are genealogists and are sitting down and looking at each of the books and evaluating whether or not they're useful. So basically they're selecting the books, and they're supposed to be adding tens of thousands of books a year, more books from time to time to this collection. It's an ongoing project. They'll just keep adding books until, I don't know if they'll ever run out, but if they do, they probably get to the point where it's harder and harder to find some new stuff. But, so they're going to be doing this, so you'll be searching, but my analogy here for doing a search like this, where you start sticking in people's names and dates and places, saying whether they're male or female, is just like if I were taking a boat out in the middle of a lake with my gun, and I go out there and start randomly shooting into the water and hoping I hit a fish. And if I hit one, I hope it's edible, and if it's edible, I hope it floats to the surface. Okay, so that's about how effective it is to go out there and just start searching and searching and searching. That's not to say that you might not hit a fish occasionally, but it's still not the most effective way to handle these programs. The next one back, if I go back to Charles Parkinson, you'll see over here it says, you can't read it of course, but it does say this, research this person. Now this is very close to being the same thing as search records with the list of the names of the websites over here on FamilySearch. And we need to mention this, I guess, because if you're watching this video presentation and you don't have those search records connections, it's probable because they may be there, but you may have to have a subscription to these services. And if you're a member of the LDS Church, you will have a free subscription. If you're not, you're going to be having to subscribe to these other websites if you want to search their records. But when you're in these websites, like MyHeritage, wrong one, then you have an ability to search this person directly out of the website. So then if I do that for Charles Parkinson, then I have a whole long list. First of all, I'm getting all of MyHeritage family trees. This whole page is full of MyHeritage family trees. What are those? Those are the smart matches for this particular person. Okay, so now I have a list of them, and I can quickly go down the list and look at what they have and see whether or not they've made the exact same typographical errors I did, so that I know they copied me. If they didn't, then they probably copied the book. But what you can see is this one, for example, it says the children, Anne, James, Sarah, private, and private. These people were from the 1700s, remember that. I don't know what they had to be private about back in 1700, but I doubt that we care about it now. Anne, James, Sarah, private, private on the next one. So somebody copied somebody, and somebody didn't do enough work to even mark these people deceased so that they showed up as a real person, and they didn't have a name, obviously, so they just stuck in two last names and said private. So undeceased people. Okay. Well, it doesn't take very long to go through a list like this and determine whether or not anybody in that list is somebody you want to talk to. Now, if I had no information and they had all these dates, I'd be all over it. I'd try to say, well, you know, who is this? How did you get this information? Who are you? And where did you find it? You know, because I would be very interested in saving myself the time and trouble of having to go find it again. I may find out that they don't know what they're talking about, but that's not always the case. We're connecting to people all over the world, and it's very, very possible that someone else has already solved my problem. Okay, but now we're going to go down through all of these people because, I mean, all these family trees, because we don't see anything that we're interested in. And we go to the second page and keep looking down through all of these entries. By the way, there are 37,436 ones to go through, which I probably won't do today. But down here, we're starting to see something different. We see a family search tree for Charles Parkinson, and this one really is in Lancashire. And this is the one that was getting confused with my entry. And then we have Charles Parkinson here, and this is the 1841 census record showing Epsody Parkinson that I found. Now, what I've discovered, of course, as I've gone doing more research, is that any one of these programs could have shown me that 1841 census. So doing the initial search and trying to match people up and getting some basic records and ideas about their geographic location and what they, you know, who they really are, it can be done from all these programs, any one of or in combination, all of them together, or whatever. So that's why this is a valuable tool, because if you keep finding them, all of them finding the same records for the same people in all different programs, you know that it's starting to look like you know who you've got. Especially if all of the place names match exactly, like I showed on the map, that they all come into a very, very small area. It doesn't mean there aren't more than one person in that small area, and you still might have the problem. That could be the problem very, very frequently in Denmark or any of the other Scandinavian countries, where you can find 5 Jens Jensens born on the same day in the same town. And you may have to get down to the house censuses to separate them apart to see who really was in all those different places in the town before you can get to separate the records. And by the way, we do run out of records occasionally. It's not, I have a presentation that we're going to give here in about 15 or 20 minutes as our first BYU webinar. And BYU Family History Library webinar, and that BYU Family History webinar, my subject is going to be on about how the records all end eventually, and why you can't get back to Adam. Well, you have to eventually, but we can't do it. And by the way, don't try to go past him. We've had people recently reporting that they've got an extra couple of generations back, and I don't think we're going to try that one. Okay, so now we know that there's some records here. If I keep going, they just get further and further away from my person. So eventually I'm not going to go through all 37,000 and I'm going to give up. But now what I want to do is I want to jump over and show how to, what to do with a record that we that we want to put into our program, whether it's Family Search or one of the desktop programs. By the way, this week there was an interesting announcement by MyHeritage. Some of you may have already, not MyHeritage, by Ancestry, that some of you might have already heard, that they are discontinuing the Family Tree Maker program at the end of the year. So the desktop program, because they say declining emphasis on desktop computers. So there's quite a big number of discussions going on about that situation. But, so, first of all, we need to find a program, and the program is called RecordSeek, RecordSeek.com. And what it does is it gives you a little, what's called an applet, a little program here that is contained in this icon that you just click on and drag up to your browser bar. And then it puts you up there, it puts it right here as a link. Now once you have that link, then you can start working here on the program. I'm going to go back home and look at all the matches I have. And I can go down here and see all the different categories. I have 75 different collections. So let's say today that I was interested in someone who was in the 1900 United States Federal Census. So I have 126 matches in the federal census. And this is my heritage. So first I'm going to filter the options because I'm going to unclick or take out the check mark for confirmed. That means I don't want to look at the confirmed ones. So whatever I've already put attached to my people, I don't want to see them again. So now when I do that, the number drops to 85 matches. Now the second problem, of course, is that because I added my data to this program years and years ago, I, at the time, added my wife's family in with my family. So all of her family is in here, and the unfortunate part for me is that she seems to get about 2 to 3 times as many record hints as I get. So whenever I look at this, most of these record hints are really for her family, so I'm not really, and she's doing her own family, and I say, well, do you want me to put in your record hints? She says, no, I'm doing that. So I'm gonna let her do that. Okay, so now we get down to one of my family members. Another thing I could do, of course, to make my life a little bit easier would be to sort these by last name. So then they come up alphabetically. And then I can go down and see if there's somebody I'm vaguely related to. And I can jump over a few pages that way to get to later address people. Actually, I want to go back one and see if there are any of my Parkinson people on here. Okay, so we're going down here. Nope, I don't have any Parkinson's, so I guess I'll have to jump out here a little bit further and see if there's some people near the end that I want to work with. No. I'm going to go back again another page. And there we have the Stapley, okay. Jane Elizabeth Stapley. There's another one, Mary Ellen Sutton, who marries a Cowan. These are my relatives. So now we want to see this, and she marries husband Hamilton Monroe Wallace. See if this is my person. I'll click on her name. So it's Tokerville residence. That's a dead giveaway. I am related to virtually every historical person in Tokerville. Because I had 2 or 3 families, the Stapleys, the Parkinsons, and the Bryants, and others who are all my relatives, all intermarried with everyone else. So by the time you go a few years forward from the founding of Tokerville, virtually everybody in the town was my cousin. Okay, so now what we're going to do? Well, we want this, but while we're waiting here for it to decide, MyHeritage has provided us with another 38 record detective matches to this family. So I don't just have this one record, I now have 38 more records that are probably very, very highly likely the same family. So whenever I do this, I've got to be ready to do it. Now, one of the things we've become interested in lately is descendancy research. Well, this is going to help us do the descendants. So we're going to add in these people. So right now I'm going to have to ignore all 38 of these, because we're not going to ever get through if I don't. And I'm going to highlight this because I'm saying, I'm not copying it, I'm just telling the program, RecordSeek, that I'm going to use to move this over to into FamilySearch, that I want this information added into the notes. So now I'm going to click on the RecordSeek. I have two choices. I can go to FamilySearch or Ancestry. It's going to have me sign in to FamilySearch again. And then it's going to, I may have to recopy it all, so I have to get out of it and redo it again. Okay, now I need that, I need her, she's, parents is Charles Stapley Jr., and I need her PIN number, so I need to know how to find her. So I'm going to have to go back to my family tree, and I'm going to go from back on the Parkinson line to where I can connect with all of these Stapleys. And then I need to get into the Stapley line. It helps if you know who you're related to. That's one of these. That's one of the very, very helpful things. So here's Charles Stapley Sr. and his family, and here's Charles Stapley Jr. and his family. And if I'm going through this very quickly, it's because, yes, I do know who all these people are. And who am I looking for? I just forgot because I was doing that. Oh, Jane Elizabeth Stapley. Okay, here she is. So now I'm going to get her personal identification number. In fact, you may not have known it, but you can triple click on the number to highlight it. You go click, click, click 3 times real fast. Don't do that unless you're experienced, because you may just end up deleting your entire computer. No. That's not. Okay, we're back to RecordSeek. We're back to the source. We go to next. We put in her number. We hit next, and we create an attach, and then that record is then attached to her, and I could also attach it to everyone else who was listed in that record, which I won't do at the present time. Okay, so what does that do for us? We have just added a record. One of the concerns that people have been talking about lately is, well, I already have that record. I already have that record from FamilySearch or from Ancestry or whatever. Well, the answer is, we're not working on records, we're working on sources. And I may have the record be 1880 or 1900 or 1910 census from FamilySearch, but there's another source for that record in Ancestry or another source in some other website. Every time I find it, I should be recording that as a source. If for any reason any of those websites went down or no longer had access to the record or for whatever reason, then I would have multiple places to go fill it in. Okay, so the idea here is, don't worry so much about duplicates, folks. The computer doesn't care. It's not like your house. You don't have to clean your closets. If there's 20 of them, it's just that tiny, tiny bit of extra memory that it's taking. But it allows us to reinforce the fact that we have more than one place to get this information. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.